Hello and welcome to In the Making, a series of conversations from North Bennett Street School where we connect with a range of new voices, fields, and perspectives. Before we get into our conversation, we want to thank the many supporters that make our programs possible, including the Massachusetts Cultural Council and our partners in craft. My name is Kristen Odell. I'm an NBSS staff member and host of In the Making. Thank you all for being with us this evening and joining us in conversation with craftsperson and furniture maker Robell Awake and Dr. Tiffany Momon of the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive. Robell, alongside with North Bennett Street School graduate Charlie Ryland, is a recent recipient of the Craft Research Fund Artist Fellowship from the Center for Craft. With this fellowship, they're researching, making, and mapping a more accurate understanding of the period furniture contributions of Black and Indigenous makers throughout our history. A key resource for this history is the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, which was founded by Dr. Momon. And thank you, Dr. Momon, for being with us again. We had you on this program a year and a half ago, and it was amazing. Thank you for being with us. And welcome to you both. And thank you for sharing your research and story with our community.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
All right, yeah, so I guess I'll take it over.
Yeah.
Just thank you, Kristen, for inviting me and us to this, and the North Bennett Street School for having this. And yeah, thank you, Dr. Momon. The BCDA is, foundational, I guess, for me and, the research that I've been doing with my friend, Charlie Ryland. When I started woodworking, I guess in like 2014, it was really hard to find anything about Black woodworkers of the past, never mind the present. And I mean, the only person that you could really find anything about was Thomas Day. And even then it was really scant sort of information. And, when the BCDA rolled around, it was such a boon for me and really kind of revitalized my furniture making practice. I'd actually taken a break from furniture for a couple of years to go back into residential construction. And the BCDA was seminal in getting me back in the shop because, I started learning about other Black furniture makers like Lewis Buckner, Henry Boyd, Richard Pointer, who we'll talk more about a little bit later. And it definitely just, it meant the world to me. And in recent years, in the past couple of years, anytime I'm asked to do something with you, Dr. Momon, I kind of pinch myself because, I've definitely admired from afar, and the work you've been doing has just been so, again, foundational for me. And yeah, I just want to thank you so much for being here. This is, I think, the third time we've spoken together, and I'm still always just like excited and amazed that I get to share a stage with you. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Let's do it. I'm going to share my screen here. And so, as Robell mentioned, I am Dr. Tiffany Momon. I am a public historian and a history professor at Sewanee, the University of the South. And I started this project, the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, primarily because, well, quite honestly, I was very angry. I, as a graduate student who loved old things, loved decorative arts, could never quite get used to the way that the decorative arts did not address all of the Black hands behind the objects that the decorative arts praises. So together with a colleague, Dr. Torrin Gadsden from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, we launched the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive in October of 2019. And so the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive is a digital humanities site dedicated to documenting the lives and experiences of Black craftspeople from this country's beginnings through 1900. And so the website is currently home to records connected to the lives of 960 Black craftspeople, both men and women, both free and enslaved, involved in 45 total trades, from wheelwrights and tanners to cabinet makers and goldsmiths, who lived and labored in the 18th century South Carolina Lowcountry and 19th century Tennessee. And so we launched the beta version of our website on August 31st, 2020. And if you visited the website within the last week, you can see that it's changed. We are in the middle of upgrading the website, adding more locations, and building out our object database, which will feature objects made by craftspeople of the past, Black craftspeople of the past, as well as contemporary Black craftspeople. And so right now, if you go out to our website, what's live is, of course, the digital archive portion, as well as the digital map. And if you were to visit the archives page, this is what you would see. And so you have the option here to browse collections. You have the option to find Black craftspeople. That option gives you the ability to search for Black craftspeople by name. If it's perhaps someone that you've heard of, that's in South Carolina and Tennessee, you can find them that way. And then you also have the option to contribute information. And what I like the most about this is that a lot of the contributions that we receive are from folks saying, you know, my grandfather was a chair maker, or my grandmother was a seamstress, my grandmother made quilts. And so being able to sort of crowdsource this information in that way and find out about lesser known makers is one of the benefits of having a project like this. It's really, really a significant benefit. In addition to the collections that you see online in South Carolina and Tennessee, we currently have, as I mentioned, we're going through a website upgrade. So shortly, very shortly, you will be able to also search collections from Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, New Orleans, and Jamaica. And we've been fortunate enough to work with a wonderful group of undergraduate students from Xavier University in Louisiana to graduate students at Warren Wilson College and the Cooperstown MA program, helping us to build out these collections. And so when we begin the search for Black craftspeople and enter them into the archive, this is the information that we're interested in collecting on screen. We use sources such as advertisements seeking the return of self-emancipated people and United States Census records to fill in the blanks. And so here is an example of someone from the archive. This is Arthur, and he is a carpenter in Nashville, Tennessee. And you can see that the date on this particular advertisement seeking his return, because he is an enslaved man, is January 21st, 1841. And so this advertisement was featured in the Nashville Union and American newspaper. And so all of the information that we were able to gather from about Arthur came from this particular advertisement. And so the second component of the website, beyond the digital archive, is the map. And to us, the map was so important because we really wanted to figure out a way for people to see Black craftspeople on the landscape. One of the things that we constantly stress to people is that if you're walking, particularly in sort of the downtown historic core of any city, you're passing the work of a Black artisan. And by highlighting the locations in which these people lived and labored, it can give you a sense of their presence on the landscape. And so you have a variety of ways of searching the data through the maps. You can search by trade, name, location, whether enslaved or free, enslaver, and also years active. And each craftsperson has a point associated with them on the map, and these points connect to last known locations when that information is available to us. They point to locations such as slave markets, plantations, and sometimes just the general areas of cities when it's proven that we can't find the exact location for someone. And so I do want to stress here that this is not a project that simply focuses on latitude and longitude points. The point of this project is to go beyond that and show people how the lives and experiences of these craftspeople played out on the landscape. And we really, really, like I mentioned, want to show people that this that these artisans were everywhere, and they had an impact on everything. And so in the example pictured here on screen is Albert Somerville. He is a cabinet maker living in Ward 3 in Nashville, Tennessee, living in Ward 3 as we found him on the United States Census in 1870. So the first census that picked up freedmen and women. And so we placed him on the map in downtown Nashville near present-day Church Street and 4th Avenue, and that was a block away from, it's a block away from present-day Printers Alley if you've ever been to Nashville. But we used a historic map also pictured here on screen to locate the vicinity of Ward 3 from 1865 to 1884. So there's a lot of thinking and a lot of steps that goes into locating features on the landscape associated with these artisans. And so also in doing a quick search, because sometimes we go beyond, we say, can we run these names through historic newspapers and find any of these folks? And you can see that in an article from the Republican Banner newspaper in Nashville on July 26, 1872, appeared Albert Somerville. And so we found out that in that period after the Civil War, that he was one of Nashville's leading African-American citizens and politicians. And so I'm going to stop here and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. That was great. That was such a great explanation of what y'all are doing. And yeah, it's just, again, like, you know, I owe everything. The work Charlie and I are doing right now really wouldn't be possible without the groundwork you laid. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So I'll talk a little bit about myself. This is me. I'm Robell, and I make furniture now. I do a little bit of teaching, furniture making, and research as well, which is kind of newer for me. But my background is mainly in construction. Really, I did a lot of things. You know, I didn't finish college, so I worked a lot of different jobs. I was a bike messenger for a few years. You know, I did construction work, everything from framing to commercial construction, to trim work, welded for a few years. If you could hit the next slide, Kristen. Yep, welded for a few years. So, you know, I kind of gravitated towards trade work because I liked that work. I liked working with my hands, and, you know, I just wasn't, whether it's just kind of my temperament and personality, you know, it was kind of hard for me to sit still and kind of finish school. So I pursued a life just kind of working with my hands. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, so in 2014, I got interested in furniture making. It started by just meeting people who made furniture on job sites, being curious and, you know, wanting to pop into their shops and on my days off and kind of learn what I could about using machines, milling lumber, and helping them with projects. And then that led me to kind of look into maybe taking a class because I was really interested in hand tools, you know, and I wanted to learn traditional methods of working wood. So, you know, there's a few schools that offered classes, nothing really in my area. So I knew, you know, I had to save for the better part of a couple years in order to take a class. And I took it at the North Bennett Street School. It was a continuing education class. It was 2 weeks. It was focused on, you know, using hand tools, so sharpening and setting up hand planes. And it was project-based. So at the end of the 2 weeks, we were responsible for making a little dovetailed box. And it was really great. Yeah, I definitely caught the bug there, and, you know, was really committed to kind of like continuing to kind of, you know, hone in on skills and develop my skills and stuff like that. The biggest issue being like, you know, there was no way for me at the time to afford any equipment or anything like that. So, luckily there's a makerspace in Atlanta, which really got started right around this time, I think, maybe a year before in 2013 or maybe even 2012. But, if it wasn't for that makerspace, this just, I don't, there's no way I could have even really pursued kind of cultivating, woodworking skills. And I never could really do it full time. So I was still in construction. I also bartended. And I did that for several years, and I made furniture out of the makerspace, and I tried to sell it. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I made stuff like this, just really trying to develop my skills. This was like an article, I think, in Fine Woodworking, where they kind of like, they don't really give you the full plans, but they kind of show you, they break down some of the construction methods. So I kind of went off of that and made this. Next slide, please. And I made stuff like this coffee table. The top was dimensioned, milled, everything by hand. The base is walnut. I did that. I use machines to do that. But I picked projects that I really tried to develop, certain techniques and skills that I was interested in kind of like learning and picking up. Next slide, please. Yep, there's this. And I think, I always knew that like, I was definitely interested in like different aesthetics than I think a lot of what, is kind of put out there in woodworking in the furniture world. So like a lot of these plans that you'll find in fine woodworking, they really are kind of either mid-century kind of pieces, shaker pieces, things that, I think are, beautiful things, but they didn't really represent an aesthetic that, I felt like expressed, my background, the traditions and aesthetics that I admire. So I always kind of like, the end goal for me was developing the skill set as a woodworker and as a craftsperson so that I could say something with my furniture. I think I was never content with just kind of like making what's out there and making kind of the same things over and over again. So I always kind of knew like the end goal for me in developing all these things and getting proficient in hand tools was so that I could, I could express some Black aesthetics, which I really wanted to kind of see in my work. Next slide, please. This was my first time teaching. This was at the Makerspace. This was a really cool experience. There was a local high school that didn't have a shop. And at the Makerspace, I was like the resident woodworker. So they asked if I would, for a semester, teach these high school students, there was about 8 of them, how to do woodworking. So, I taught them the basics, how to mill lumber, dimension it, glue, glue up a tabletop. The picture on the left are some students cleaning up some bridle joints. So they got a little taste for traditional joinery and using hand tools. So we built 2 tables. There were 8-foot long tables and 4 benches for their lunchroom. And they did an amazing job. It was such a great experience. My first time teaching, and I knew I definitely, if the opportunity presented itself again, I would be up for it. So next slide, please. So here is me in Ethiopia. And this is, so my parents immigrated from Ethiopia in the early 70s. They met here. And my brother and I were born here. And I've been back a few times, and this was the last time I went back. This was about 6 years ago. And when I went back the last time, I was interested in going to an ethnographic museum there to see what they had in terms of furniture. And I was just blown away by this chair making tradition there that, the chair that I'm looking at in this picture is carved out of a single log. And, as a woodworker who kind of like has been absorbing, all of the type of woodworking that's very accessible, like, workshop woodworking that uses kiln dried lumber, seeing something like this, it just kind of blew my mind. And I was just really scratching my head as to how this could be done, and I knew that kind of like maybe the the way to kind of understand it would be green woodworking, which is working recently felled trees, lumber that's still really wet, that hasn't been seasoned or dried. And because that's the way traditionally most cultures around the world have worked wood. And in early America, the same thing. If you weren't like a high style cabinet maker, and you were more of a local kind of small time furniture maker, a lot of times you were working with green. So I knew that that kind of could be a way I could maybe come close to understanding how to make a chair like that. Next slide, please. So there's my little shop. I built that during the pandemic. On nights and weekends, I still had my construction job. And there's my buddy Robbie. Shout outs to Robbie. He is a super talented furniture maker, really good friend of mine. He's helping me move in to the shop in this picture. So during the pandemic, I couldn't really access the makerspace anymore. And I did have the financial means now to build a little shop. And I mean, it's tiny, it's 10 by 10 feet. But it's enough for what I'm doing. And I love it. Next slide, please. So there's a little detail shot. There's the inside, gets a lot of really good natural light. Okay, yeah, you can get, that's good. So there's the first chair I made. It's a Windsor chair. I was invited up to Greg Pennington's shop in Tennessee. He's a chair maker there who makes and teaches Windsor chair making. And I was there for 5 days and learning how to make a Windsor chair. So I carved the seat, I carved the spindles, the crest rail, all of that. Greg turned all of the legs and everything. The undercarriage was kind of done by Greg. And it was a great introduction into chair making for me and just kind of getting a taste for the tools and a better understanding of green woodworking, because a lot of the processes in making Windsor chairs involves green woodworking. Next slide. So I got a grant with my friend Charlie through the Center for Craft. And as Kristen mentioned, we are interested in the furniture making traditions of Black and Indigenous folks in America. And those traditions can include period furniture, but are not exclusive to just period furniture. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide, please. So here's a pointer chair. Our research has really begun to center around the Pointer family of chair makers. They're based in Central Tennessee. Richard Pointer, who started making chairs, who started the family business really, was making chairs in the early 1800s. And this is one of our favorite chairs that we saw on our trip to go look at Pointer chairs and go to different museums in Central Tennessee. And it's such an amazing story. And I think, as I started, getting more into chair making and making the chairs that I'm making now, it's really understanding the Pointer story that has fueled my work. And I think these stories that were so difficult, still are difficult to access for people who are getting into furniture making. To me, they were the most motivating thing for me to get in the shop, because I wanted to be in conversation with Richard Pointer. I wanted to make these the forms that he made, and I wanted to add my own, flavor to it and my own, kind of my own vibes to the form. And I think that's something that, it's like this work of kind of researching and looking into Black furniture making traditions is central to my practice now. So we'll talk more about that later. So you can go hit the next slide. So these are other examples of Jimma chairs. They're just, I'm obsessed with them. I've never seen two that look alike. They're incredible. Again, they're carved out of a single log. And I wanted to incorporate that kind of with the Pointer form. So you can hit the next slide. So I made this chair. This was the first ladder back chair that I made, inspired by the Pointer form, as well as Jimma chair carvings. You can hit the next slide. And then here's the second chair I made. There on the left, that's the shop, and I'm mid-weaving the seat. And I've really enjoyed seat weaving. That's been a cool thing to get into. Next slide. And here is the latest chair that I made. This one is actually inspired by quilt patterns from the quilters of Gee's Bend. So it's also inspired by another multi-generational family of Black chair makers called the Hunters from South Carolina. And I was looking at some images of their chairs, and they had octagonal posts, which I did here. And they also really liked using finials, which are at the top of the rear posts. So I definitely wanted to incorporate that. And they did have kind of a shape, sort of a W shape to their back slats. The Hunters did. They were thicker. And I just kind of thinned them out, made them a little wavier because that's a snake pattern. And then on top of that, I kind of superimposed in the carving a housetop pattern. Which is something that was done in very different variations in Gee's Bend. It was a pattern that was done. So yeah, that was the inspiration for that chair. And I think that's it. I think that's the last slide. Yep, and there's my info. So yeah, so I guess now, Dr. Momon, we can just kind of like talk a little bit. You know, I know we want to leave a little time for questions and stuff, but I had some questions for you. So I'll just start if that's okay.
Sure.
And I wanted to ask, how did you get into this work and why? What is so special about the decorative arts to you?
I think just as a child, I was always someone who liked things, who liked lots of things. I could spend hours with my mom wandering around an antique mall. And when I went to graduate school and began studying public history, I sort of quickly realized I was like, because I'd been out of undergrad for a while, I'd worked in corporate America for a while, went back to grad school, and I was like, wait, there are people who study furniture. And so that's sort of what led me to this. And I think really it was spending a summer at a summer institute and having an object that summer. My object was an architectural interior from a circa 1810 home in Southampton County, Virginia. So a witness site actually to the Nat Turner uprising. And so I was thinking as I was researching this room, well, why has no one in this museum ever discussed this room in the context of Nat Turner? And then I was like, well, why haven't they discussed the fact that the house that this room came out of was owned by a Quaker enslaver who left behind a will where he very much clearly talks about the enslaved people on his farm. And he talks about the enslaved blacksmiths and how much he liked their work and how he wanted he wanted to will these men to his sons so they could also enjoy the work of the blacksmiths. And so that's where I started there, and then it snowballed. And then I actually went back to the Summer Institute, and that's where the idea for the BCDA came, because my project that summer was to study a Black craftsperson out of Charleston, South Carolina, named John Quash Williams. And it was an interesting project because I was studying a home that he completed about 1746, but the home no longer stands. And so it was figuring out a way to recreate this home through the documentation that was left behind. So then I could tap into sort of the skill and the artistry of John Williams. And it was there that this sort of light bulb went off. And I realized that I was tracing John Williams and the enslaved men who worked for him because he was given his own work crew all around Charleston and the Low Country. And so I could pinpoint that they were at this person's house, they were at that person's house, they were making this, they were making that. And I really thought, well, if I can do it for these 8 men, who else can I do this for? And so that's where the project really came from. And it was really, I mentioned that it sort of came from that idea of a lack in the decorative arts. This was a collection that didn't exist, but that needed to exist.
Yeah, beautiful. I have a question that it's something I kind of struggle with and I've been thinking about a lot. is what are some things you consider when you're either framing or telling the story of enslaved craftspeople?
Something that's always in the back of my mind is, particularly because the project is a digital archive. So it's a collection. We're collecting things, right? But it's how to make sure that we are thinking more than collecting, and we're thinking about the ways that we humanize folks. So thinking about the ways that we take folks beyond just a name in an archive to really deep dive into their lives and their experiences. And then how we make that accessible, how we share that with people so that it doesn't become one of these things where it's like, oh, that was so long ago, et cetera, et cetera. It's this thing that's very much still here with us because the things that they made are very much so still with us. So it's really making sure that we always do that, that we sort of keep that in the forefront of our minds, that we're constantly thinking about the ways we share this info, how we write about this info, what language, what words we're using, and how, you know, just to be good stewards to these stories.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's difficult too. Sometimes I think about, like, you know, the balancing act it takes to communicate how, you know, Black craftspeople at this time, a lot of folks were able to like maneuver in a super oppressive society through their skill, right? We're able to kind of get a little bit of breathing room and agency. It's like, how do you tell that story, which is super empowering, you know, about like how people were able to kind of carve out a life for themselves and maybe kind of insulate them a little bit from the, you know, antebellum society in the South, but also not downplay, you know, just how crazy of a time that was. Yeah.
Absolutely. And your question just made me think of a question for you. In that thinking about the ways that you approach the Richard Pointer story. And he very much so has one of those stories where he is navigating this antebellum world. Could you tell us a little bit about that work?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the Richard Pointer story has just like really captivated me and Charlie as we've been researching it. For one reason, the form itself, the chair, which I showed earlier, it's the style of chair is called a mule-eared ladderback chair. You know, it's definitely kind of like there's a resurgence in interest of this form. There's a lot of ladderback chair classes, mule-eared ladderback chair classes. And a lot of, you know, the times this chair is called anything but a pointer chair, right? Like, I think there are slight variations that different makers have made in the 20th century, but they're fundamentally the same chair. And, you know, that's kind of the erasure. When we're talking about erasure, you know, for me as a furniture maker, that's a glaring one for me. You know, this chair is called a Jenny Alexander chair. Some call, there's a similar chair called a Boggs chair. They're all variations of this mule-eared ladderback that Richard Pointer really pioneered. You know, there's no way for us to really know if, you know, he was the first person to ever make this mule-eared ladderback, you know, to really have that relief cut and bend the rear post. And I think that's not even as important as the fact that this chair was just called a pointer chair, this style of chair. And that in the early 1850s, while he was still enslaved, he took out an ad in the newspaper in Franklin County, Tennessee, advertising his chairs and calling them the original pointer chair. He said, "I'm the maker of the original pointer chair." And, you know, in different talks, we've showed that that advertisement in the newspaper. And I think he's saying that, you know, he's claiming authorship then, and he's still claiming authorship to this day for me. You know, when I see that, I'm like, he's telling you whose chair this is, you know, and to me, it really frustrates me that it's called all these other names but a pointer chair. That's just a huge erasure for me. Yeah.
And in doing that, going back to that idea of language and the words we use, and Pointer just saying, "This is, I'm the maker of the original," is really powerful. researched Pointer and his chairs. Is there anything about that particular story that has really stuck with you?
Yeah, I think in the way it kind of gets told now, again, it's like, to me, it's such a fascinating story because, you know, here's somebody and we have to think, like, at this time, 1850s Tennessee, there really is no way, if you are to manumit somebody who is enslaved, if you were to say, purchase your freedom, that person would have to leave Tennessee. So what we do know through census records is that at some point he is recorded on the census as a free person of color, right, just before the Civil War. So we don't know what that means, right? Because there's no official manumission records for him. And if he were to have been manumitted or get his freedom, he would have had to leave the state. So what kind of like purgatory was he in, And I think, like, that's why, I really kind of try to shy away from, like, an absolute, like, oh, he freed himself. Like, he through his skill and his craft, he was able to free himself. I think it's more nuanced and complicated than that. I think he was able to gain prominence as a enslaved maker through his skill, that there was a gray area he was able to navigate for himself and his family, to where he may not have been officially free, but for all, because they liked him at that given, like, in this period of time, he was able to maybe have a lot more agency than somebody who would typically be enslaved would. So yeah, I challenge, I really, I struggle with there have been a couple articles on Pointer and them stating and just claiming that he bought his freedom. I don't think it's that clear cut.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let me see. What do you hope the BCDA's impact to be?
I was actually speaking about this very thing with some students from Warren Wilson College in their MA in Craft Studies program. And I tell people all the time, when I started the BCDA, I thought it was just going to sort of be my side project. I was fresh out of grad school, teaching at a university, just getting started there. And I sat in my office one day and I was like, I'm just going to go buy the domain name. It just sort of kept going.
Yeah.
But, I think about this all the time, that I want people to use a resource like the BCDA and just take it and run with it. Take it, use it to be great, use it to do great research, use it to influence museum interpretation, use it to build exhibits and write papers, and books, or whatever the case may be. Use it to just share this story of Black craftspeople in whatever way that they can. And I think that's amazing. I think it's awesome. And I always want, if anybody ever uses it, I'm like, tell me what you do with it. Because that's just, it's just one of those things where it's like, I see it, especially when I'm working with students, I really see it, the ways that we conduct research at the BCDA, sort of the care and the thought that we take when we approach that work, is something that I really want to instill in students who study this type of work. But it takes that type of care to really tell a story like this. It takes that thoughtfulness to tell a story like this. And also to inspire the ways that we do research. It's, I'm thinking about sort of how, I'm thinking about I'm thinking about Thomas Kamara right now, right? The Black potter out of New York, and how he's a free Black man, and he's on the New York City census. It says Thomas Kamara, a Black, right? But he gets misidentified as a white French man, and nobody really, I guess, does the research until the 2010s. When someone discovers Kamara again on the census, where it says Thomas Kamara, a Black. And I think about that a lot, because I'm going, if only there were more people trained in this research, right? Trained to know how to find Black craftspeople, what avenues to take, et cetera, then Thomas Cameron wouldn't have been thought of as a white Frenchman for
Right.
100+ years. And I mean, and he was a Black man who was fighting for abolition and going
Yeah.
to Liberia and all of this great stuff.
Wow. Yeah.
Proud of his Blackness, right? And
Yeah.
misidentified just because of a lack of research. So yeah, I think about that a lot, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. I mean, it's like, I think that's why it's so important for more Black people to do this work, because I do think when you come with a certain lens, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, you're going to see what you want to see, you know? And I do think so much of the decorative arts is really invested in like myth making or continuing like the American myth, right? And I think about, you know, just kind of stepping back a little bit, I'm like, you know, for the longest time, decorative arts has just really been a symbol of empire, right? It's just like it's a big flex, you know? And I think like, and it still kind of is. And I think like, that's not the objects that I think should be centered in decorative arts museums, first of all. You know, I gravitate more towards what more everyday people made and like the significance of them and the power and presence they have because of the lives and the people that interacted with them. But I think like, even if you are going to center landed, rich, you know, white material culture, you at least have to be honest about who made those things, right? And I think like, you know, just last year, it's my first time going into some of these decorative arts museums, you know, and I'm seeing pieces by like Thomas Elf, Robert Walker. And, you know, I just remember an article in 2017 where, you know, they discovered there was an auction and a collector was looking at a Robert Walker piece, pulled out a drawer and saw a signature, and it said Boston, you know, 1790 something. And no, sorry, Boston, October 18th, I have it right here, 1805. And going through census data, we see that Boston at this time was a free person of color. In the 1790 census, he was a free person of color. By 1805, when he signed it, he was in his 70s. So I'm thinking like, this 70-something-year-old man doesn't give a bleep anymore. You know what I mean? He's like, I've been making these cabinets, you know, I want to be known. I want to kind of put it discreetly somewhere that like, this is my work, you know? And I think like, you know, so many of these big cabinet shops, like, I think if, you know, there's a lot of hand wringing that's like, oh, well, we can't prove who made what. Well, I'm like, well, then you can't prove Robert Walker made a single thing, you know? So I think at least on these placards, you got to acknowledge that Robert Walker enslaves people. They most likely made some things in his shop and we don't know who to credit, you know, instead of just by default crediting Robert Walker.
This is something that came out of this shop where all of these folks were present, right? About that Boston signature, because I'm like thinking about what it means, first of all, to sign your name on something, but to also sign your name on something in a way at the bottom of the underside of a drawer where it's never meant to be seen, right? And just thinking about, you know, what that means, the placement of that signature in that place, just, you know, I'm signing this, I'm going to take credit for it in this way, and I'm going to put it here discreetly. And yes,
yeah, really powerful stuff. Yeah. Okay, I think it's 7:45.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in because we have questions coming through, but I think that all of us here could listen to the two of you talk all evening if we could.
Oh, thank you.
I'm just going to throw out some questions already from some of our guests. For Robell, can you talk a little bit more about how you and Charlie define or approach research as craftspeople?
I think, you know, how we approach it, which is why I think it's really cool for more craftspeople to get involved in this research. Because I remember the first time, you know, we met up with Dr. Momon at the Franklin House, really the Franklin Plantation. And we were looking at pointer chairs because they have a huge collection. You know, Charlie and I were noticing things as people who make furniture that I think maybe decorative arts scholars don't really see that could add a lot to the story. So yeah, I think our approach is definitely material based. And we're really interested in construction and things like that. But the more I do this, I'm just as captivated by the history and the story behind the people who are making the objects. So I think both play an important role. And I think that's why it's like, it's really important and special to have a decorative arts scholar like Dr. Momon and a pseudo scholar furniture maker like myself to also to be there looking at the same things and really like sharing ideas and kind of like, yeah, it just brings kind of a different lens. And it was really cool. That experience was really cool.
This is a question for both of you, answer whoever wants to first. Do you have any hope or aspirations for how the work you both do will shape how the general public views Black craftspeople past and present? And this goes to a question I had for you, Robell. You both can answer this. In the scope of that question, you know, let's get specific. What are your goals, you know, within education, industry change, narrative change?
Yeah.
Thinking about the first half of that question, I think it appears, it pops up prominently, right? And thinking about change in the field and everything like that. And so many exhibitions that are open now or that are in the process of opening. So I'm thinking about Colonial Williamsburg right now has an exhibition up that's called I Made This, and it's all about Black makers in the decorative arts. And then you have, of course, the Hear Me Now show at the Met on the Black Potters of Edgefield that's traveling to Boston and into Atlanta pretty soon. And so when I'm thinking about how the field is changing, those are some of the biggest changes I've seen. And I'm thinking about that too, because when I was at Colonial Williamsburg about a year ago, I noticed that they changed their object labels. And so there is a white cabinet maker and slaver there, Anthony Hay. And we know that there was a Black presence in the Hay cabinet making shop. And so the objects that they have on display, they now say from the Anthony Hay cabinet making shop. And there's a longer panel that talks about enslaved labor in that shop. So those are some of the changes that I've seen recently. And I think sort of this larger resurgence in interest in Black craft, because it's changed so much in the last two years, maybe, is great. And I think that, you know, it's heavily sort of influenced by what audiences, what folks are interested in, what scholars are interested in, and also what institutions are finally realizing in that these are topics, these are things that folks want to see. This is information that people want to know. So I hope I answered that question correctly.
No, that was it. Yeah.
But what about you, Robell, with this work, this project you're doing? What are your hopes, aspirations in education? You know, what's the goal with this? What's your heart of hearts goal?
Yeah, I mean, I think getting that information out there, you know, I think for me, it's like, you know, I think there's a real need for a more accurate telling of our history in all of its many realms and facets. And I think there's still, in 2023, there's still pushback, you know, in our education system to have an accurate telling of our history, because that myth, we still want to push that myth. And I think like that myth is extremely damaging, you know, and for me, you know, like I think there's, you know, I think the truth is just kind of the only way towards any type of forward movement that one might call a semblance of progress. You know, I think we definitely need a more honest portrayal of this nation's history. And we're far from really even getting close to painting the extent to which Black people did things in this country. And I think for me too, it's like, you know, growing up and going to public schools here in the South, you know, you don't learn anything about skilled Black craftsmanship, craftspeople. And, you know, that's really damaging, you know, and I think like it's frustrating to me that, you know, people are still fighting, you know, stories like this to be in textbooks, you know, so yeah, so I think the work is just like, you know, to continue to build on this body of work of, and on this, research, and then there's just so much more to be done.
I love I love craft as a medium to tell these stories and truth, just craft or a made object, because you can't deny the existence of the object, and you can't deny the existence of the maker, because maker's marks are all over the objects. I mean, to our eyes, there's a lot of misinformation around, as you were talking about, but it's, as a physical object, you can't deny that it exists. So I love craft as a mode for the storytelling and truth telling.
Yeah.
A really beautiful question here. Do you feel that researching histories of enslaved Black craftspeople is or can be emotionally taxing as Black scholars?
Oh, absolutely. I tell people all the time, there's a reason why my research outside of Black craft stops about 1920, right? Because studying subjects like the civil rights movement, I know people, my mother and my father lived that, right? So it's so recent to me that it can be emotionally draining. But absolutely, because you get angry, right? Anyone studying this type of history gets angry, because you read a lot about a lot of mistreatment, a lot of anti-Black violence. You get angry at the systems that exist. You get angry at the facts that these are the conditions in which these people lived. And even though we are living in the present, everything that they went through, we still can't tell their stories in museums. We still get shot down when we try to pitch these types of exhibitions with everything that we know now. So yeah, it can be very emotionally taxing and draining and upsetting. But it's one of those things for me that, sometimes you do step back and you take a little break. You have to take a breather at some point.
Yeah.
So what about you, Robell?
Same, I remember, meeting you on that trip to Franklin and going to the Franklin house. Like, that was my first time at a plantation ever in my life. I'm 37 years old. And I remember seeing those chairs and I'm like, what the hell are these doing here? You know what I mean? Like, I know there's a big push for repatriation of, objects during the time of colonization in European museums. And I think we need to talk about domestic repatriation and getting these objects back and out of plantations. And there are so many amazing objects that enslaved people made that are sitting, and that the families that own these plantations are still profiting off of tours and people coming to see these objects made by enslaved people, and I remember being in there and I'm just like, excuse me, I'm just like, okay. It's extremely frustrating. You get really angry.
And you go to places like plantations and they aren't even telling that story.
No.
You can see it. It's almost like, I don't know, you're being forever gaslit, because you can see it. You can see the evidence of these people here, but you go on these tours and tour guide never mentions it. Doesn't talk about who made the house, who made the furniture, who lived there. Outside of the majority of the people who are living there, but like who lived there outside of the enslaver and enslaver's family.
Yeah.
So this touches on another question that I had about, and you've referenced it throughout this conversation, the role of the museum and, some problematic areas there. And Robell, your research included visits to the Whitney Plantation, Yale Furniture Collection, Winterthur, and then you're going to work with Indigenous craftspeople in the Northwest. And I'm combining this with what you just mentioned, Dr. Momon, about one of the BCDA's goals is to collect in a humanizing way. And this idea that museums, historically separate artifact from the maker or the culture of where that make came from. I mean, what is something for better or for worse that you've witnessed in this museum culture, sort of in that context? I know that's a tough one. That's broad.
I was thinking to myself, how much time do we have?
I know.
Robell, do you want to go first or?
No, you go.
Okay. I think the biggest mistake museums make, specifically thinking about art museums here, is that they try to separate the object from the larger context of the maker's lived experience. And you can't do that. Like, you cannot separate the conditions that object was made from its maker, you know? And that's one of the things that I find the most upsetting when they're like, look, it's a chair made by an enslaved person. And I'm like, let's talk about that a little bit more, right? What that experience might have been like. What type of duress was that person under when they made that chair? What is the larger context of their experience that influenced what they made, how they might have felt when they were making this object? Has that person been separated from their family, or, you know, all of these sorts of things? And so when you sort of nip that history off and you say that, oh, that's uncomfortable, nobody wants to talk about enslavement, you're doing everybody a disservice. Like, I cannot scream that loudly enough, right? You cannot separate that Black artist from the context under which they created that art. It's too integral to understanding them and to understanding what they made, why they made it, why it's made that way.
Yeah, 100%.
Thank you. Robell, unless you want to answer that for yourself, Robell.
No, you can go on.
Okay. Robell, is there going to be, like the BCDA, will there be a place where you and Charlie's research talks will be publicly viewable?
Yeah, we're still, we're gonna be, Warren Wilson has a critical craft studies program, and Charlie and I contributed a piece to their journal, their like end of year journal. So that will be published sometime this year. And yeah, we're thinking about different things. The grant ends in an exhibition of work inspired by the research at the Center for Craft in Asheville. So we're making work for that show. But yeah, yeah, we're still trying to think about how to best present it.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I have one last question. This is, Robell, for you. This is just for a personal question.
Yeah.
So if anybody, most of you here know Robell and have been also follow Dr. Tiffany Momon. Robell has an epic social media situation. I mean, you're just doing it right. You're dialed in, the soundtrack, it's just, such great content.
Thank you.
And in one of your posts, you reference Pan-Afrofuturism. And this is so cool to me and so interesting. In a recent conversation with Chanupa Hanska Luger, Indigenous artist, Chanupa combines sci-fi futuristic imaginings in Indigenous culture, using sci-fi to convey sort of potential histories, if you will. How do you relate to some of this in your work?
Yeah, so I should say that, like, first of all, I just kind of came up with that. It was kind of like this weird pseudo poem on a post, and I just kind of threw that out there. But I think the way I was conceptualizing it is less like, when I think about Afrofuturism, I think less sci-fi kind of aesthetic, and I think more about the future of Black people on this planet and what that looks like. And by including Pan, I'm definitely including like concepts of Pan-Africanism, which is kind of solidarity amongst Indigenous African people on the continent, as well as Black folks in the diaspora, and how both lenses and understandings are the way forward for us. And I think a lot of that, I'm super interested in not only Black aesthetics and aesthetic traditions, but also, technology, and technology that I feel like oftentimes doesn't get framed as technology. And, whether it be sustainable building materials that, peoples on the continent have been using for decades. And I think a lot, as more people, I think, are waking up to the fact that like Mother Nature is fighting back and trying to tell us that like our system is not working and is leading to us to destruction. I think we're definitely going to have to look to, you know, technologies that people have been, sustainable technologies that people have been using, you know, for such a long time, and see them as technology and add to them. You know, these aren't stagnant things. So yeah, it's less kind of like a sci-fi outlook and more kind of like, you know, it's going to take, because there's a part of me, sorry, maybe I'm just kind of rambling. There's a part of me that does think like, you know, sci-fi for me kind of is like, it can feel like, this is going to sound really messed up. It can kind of feel like white cosplay of oppression. You know what I mean? Like I'm thinking of like Star Wars and stuff like that. And I'm like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm just kind of like, I don't know. I don't really vibe with that. So I hear you. You hear what I'm saying? Yeah. So
I hear you. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, this was a beautiful sentiment from this other artist, just as a way to kind of re-envision what Indigenous existence, you know, could be.
Got you.
Yeah. But I love what you're saying, you know, about using technologies that already exist. And I'm imagining that you're referring to, for example, you know, greenwood chair making. I mean,
yeah, or cob, you know, we're using like mud and straw to build homes. I know there's a lot of cool people doing stuff around cob construction, you know, and just kind of exploring that as a sustainable and very viable building material. So yeah, because for me, somebody that's worked in construction for a long time, you know, like it's just so crazy how toxic a lot of the things that we use to build homes are, and it doesn't have to be that way, you know. And I think so much of it is just like we've created this industry for whatever reason that's so extractive, right, and that's so damaging to our planet, and you know, it's just so hard to kind of, you know, switch from that, but we have to, you know. Yeah.
Okay, sorry to derail us there.
No worries.
We're here, and thank you both so much. I just want to thank our guests for being here with us this evening. It's 8 o'clock, and Dr. Momon and Robell, thank you so much for sharing all of your information, research, brains, everything. We value your work so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. And we'll see you soon, and everybody have a great evening.
Bye.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you. Take care.